everybody. This is T. Falcon Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. Today we're going to start a new discussion. This has to do with the Oracle of the Self and using the Oracle of the Self as a tool for personal growth and development. In prior calls, we've started to talk briefly about what kind of a ChangeWorks profile might we want to invite people to complete as a first step into this whole Oracle of the Self understanding and approach. And so we'd been talking about wheels of life and all the different sorts of goal setting programs that are out there. And so I said, all right, fine, I'm going to go ahead and do my own merging of brilliance. And I spent a good deal of time seeking out as many different models of goal setting in a coaching sort of a setting to just go like, all right, well, what are all these different possibilities? Well, if all you did was a simple Google search for life areas to set goals in, you would find on page 1 of your Google results, you would find here's 6 key areas. Oh no, here's 7 key areas. Nope, there's 8, 9, 10, 11. There's everybody and their brother seems to have put together some sort of their own assessment around different life areas for goal setting. Some of them have turned them into kind of like a wheel of life, sort of a diagram. So there's all kinds of things. So I went, all right, well, are there 6 areas? Are there 8 areas? Are there 12 areas? Now, you all know me. The merging of brilliance tells me the first thing I have to do is slap them all together. And so let me show you what it is that I came up with. I'll slide something into the screen, and then we'll get to our new little diagram, pardon me. That's our new little diagram we're going to be looking at. But let me slide this over here, little Word document. Hopefully you guys are seeing this. Yes.
Yes.
And so these are the combined factors of wheels of life as I kind of went through them. They're in no particular order. These are just things that I stumbled across. So pretty much they all have a lot of these in common. So there's family goals that people might have, or family as a life area to be looking at. And then there's career. Almost always they included the word advancement. Okay, friends and social functions, some of them divide those two, that participating in a social function is a very different goal set than having good friends that don't necessarily involve social functions. Health and wellness and fitness, self-care, those all kind of got mentioned, and some got separated, some got all lumped together. If you were looking at a wheel of life specifically about wellness, then you would find it broken down into things like nutrition and exercise, meditation, all of the different sub-goals one might set in the overall category of health and fitness and wellness and all those good sorts of things. Education was on almost every one of them. Some of them were about formal education. Some were about lifelong learning. Some even believe that every experience a human has an educational element to it, or at least a potential for education involved in it. Because, I mean, look at the next one, travel and entertainment. Some of the greatest things I've ever learned, I've learned because of travel. And I don't know that entertainment is necessarily categorically the same as travel. I've done a lot of travel that was not entertaining, and I've had a lot of entertainment that didn't involve traveling. So nevertheless, they seem to want to lump those two together. Charitable activity. Some life models decided to say, well, there's charitable giving. There's also volunteering. If you were looking at a kind of a wheel of life specifically around your financial situation, then charitable giving was a separate category. And I don't even think volunteering made it onto their list. Your primary relationship. Obviously, they're obviously focusing more on your spouse or whoever your significant other may be. Your spiritual life, and that also very often got broken down into umpteen sub little spokes. Personal appearance, I thought, that's interesting that we have life goals around personal, but someone had that. Material possessions, personal development, your home. They also had home as a possession versus home as a state of mind. or overall environment that you're in. That's a little bit further down the list. Cultural experience, which is apparently somehow different than travel and entertainment. Mental health, your environment, there you go. Self-image, some consider that different than personal appearance. Personal appearance was apparently an outward manifestation or an outward focus, and self-image was more of an internal focus. One was about creating space for privacy. Then there was security. Some talked about financial security, physical security, etc. Freedom, creating a legacy. And so then you start seeing all these other ones: body, mind, and emotions, intimate relationships, family got repeated, social, friends, fun. So can you guys see kind of like this heavy level of repetition or reappearance of these different angles one could look at? Yes, Frank.
Yes,
Yes,
that
you.
list you just read right there, the body, mind, emotions, and so on. That's often University of Scranton does a New Year's resolution study every year. And
Mm,
often at the top of that list has something to do with money, has something to do with the body in terms of health, and they study like how long it takes for people to actually fall off
yep,
the
yep, yep,
wagon,
yep.
so to speak, in terms of
Yeah, yep, yep, yep. And so, as I'm looking at this, I'm kind of going like, well, that's interesting. So they got their eight. And then this one, love relationships. I like that at least they provide a little bit of a definition. So I just copy and pasted it. Love relationships, friendships, adventures, environment, health and fitness, intellectual life, skills. That was a separate one. Spiritual life, career, creative life, family life, and community life. I thought, okay, they've got 12. That's all interesting. Then someone decided to actually turn it into more of a wheel that one naturally leads. They showed a bit of a progression. It fell apart very quickly, but nevertheless, good for them for giving it a try. But they said there were four major categories of goals. So there are some mental goals that included your contribution to the world around you and your personal growth. Okay. There were physical goals that included wealth and health, emotional goals that included relationships with friends and family and relationships with your life partner, and spiritual goals that involve relationships with yourself and connections at some greater level of spiritual and guidance. So I thought that was interesting. Then I stumbled across one of my personal favorite, thank you very much. This is goal setting based on the series of novels Divergent. So I don't know if any of you were fans of Divergent or you saw the Divergent movies or anything like that, but it talks about this dystopian world where everybody at a particular age gets assigned or chooses to be part of a particular faction. And the faction you choose is going to become your life. And you will live only with members of that faction, and you will do only those things that that faction happens to do. Well, as you looked at each one of the factions, a different set of goals would be associated with each one of them. And so candor is all about the honest. And so the great thing about candor is that you really wanted candor to be running the government, to be running any kind of thing that had to do with law or anything like that, because they simply were unable to be dishonest. Then abnegation were the selfless, and these were the people who volunteered their time and their energy. They were never concerned about anything as far as personal status, so they all lived in absolutely identical houses. They all wore absolutely identical gray clothing, and they spent all day, every day doing nothing but being of service to others, very often at their expense of their own self-sacrifice. Then you had Amity, the peaceful. They were really known as being the farmers. And so they spent their time in nature. And all they really cared about was cultivating peacefulness, quiet, serenity. That's what they were all about. Dauntless were the brave. They were the protectors of everybody. They created risk where it didn't exist purely to make things more interesting, but you could completely rely upon them to intervene on your behalf. They took care care of everybody else, even though some of them ended up becoming quite brutal in and of themselves, etc. Then the erudite, these were the intellectuals, the smarts of the smarts, and on and on. And so you would need to belong to one of these categories. And I thought it was interesting that they came up with 3 specific goals for each of these 5 factions. Now, the problem is that none of these factions include anything about having adventure for the sake of having an adventure. None of them talk about having fun. So there's this whole missing element to it. And that's in part of the basis of the novel, because if you did this test and your test showed that you actually had capabilities in more than one faction, you were considered to be a divergent, and you were the most threatening thing to the entire society. Someone who could actually be 2 or more of these factions simultaneously were considered to be the most dangerous of the dangerous. And if they discovered you were a divergent, you would become factionless and you would be expelled from the society altogether. So I thought, isn't that interesting that there you have someone who created this whole kind of I want to say world, and did their best to kind of say this world is all inclusive. But what did they choose to eliminate from their world to make their story possible? And then at no time do any of these things talk about having a goal of avoiding something. Even if you look at quadrant-based personality tests, if you hold any kind of belief that personality typing is actually valid, then it is not a giant step to say inside of each one of those personalities, you would find a set of goals that tend to be more prevalent, more important to, more pronounced in each one of those personalities. And that would mean that depending on which personality type you are, there may be other personality types that have goals that you do not share at all. And so I thought it was just very interesting to say, if we decide to do a deeper dive and we decide to actually, do our merging of brilliance exercise, we may find out that where goals come from and what actually serves as a motivational focus in an individual's life could be very different than whatever this subset we extract and say, here is the wheel of life. Now, obviously, from a coaching perspective, we would ultimately want to say to individuals that your wheel of life is unique to you. And we have no right, no authority, no. We can't tell you what belongs on your wheel. And we can't tell you that unless you include all of these different aspects on your wheel, you will always have an out of balance life that just doesn't roll. I mean, it's a wheel, it's supposed to roll. And so who are we to say that? Aren't we really more about saying each individual has the right to construct their own life in the way that they want most? And our goal is to help them to explore the possibilities so they don't really miss anything, and then help them to put their life together in such a way that their wheel rolls, that it brings them what they're looking for. So I'll shut up for just a second before we move on to the next little piece of this. But guys, have any thoughts, comments, insights you'd like to share on this whole subject of goal setting and wheels of life and figuring out what someone's complete wheel should look like? Any thoughts, comments around that? Paula, go right ahead.
Hi, Dee.
Hi there.
Well, and I'm sorry for the noise in the background. For me, the wheel has always been just a guide. It's more of a tool to open up conversation and to gain a better understanding. So, like you said, that wheel doesn't necessarily reflect, a perfect set of 6 or 7 or 8 all the way around for a symmetrical, you know, um, motion. It's more about what fits the person. I
Yeah,
am
yeah.
curious though. I really love that the fact that are you looking to overlay this on It's been a while, so I'm actually happy to be here, T.
Yes, it does in fact overlay on the change grid, and that's what we're
Okay,
going to be
great.
looking at today. Yeah. Because my thought is like, as you said, someone's first wheel of life, these are for screening purposes, just to get some thoughts going,
Right,
some conversation happening. But even then you have to go like, well, then I need to be very sensitive to which wheel I choose,
right.
because the
You
act of
know,
choosing one wheel sort of unselects, deselects the rest of them. And
well,
so,
it,
it's kind of
it
weird, isn't
doesn't
it?
just it doesn't, because that's a more literal look at it. Yes,
Yeah.
if you're looking at it simply as a basis of like getting the kids in the car and giving them a change of environment, the story that was shared earlier, and getting them someplace to open up and talk through,
Hmm.
then it doesn't matter what's on the wheel. It's just a place to start.
Right. And or I like sometimes I see wheels that are left with blank spokes, and you're allowed to populate that spoke with whatever life area you think it needs to have in order to make it a little bit more like you. So rather than swinging all the way to a totally blank wheel and letting the individual populate it from scratch, they kind of give you a little bit of a hybrid. So here's a few to get you going, but at least visually they're saying this is not meant for you to interpret as being a complete representation of the full range of goals someone might have in their life. And I brought that up because as I was looking at all these different models, some of them actually do present themselves as being complete, and they have 8 areas on them. And you go, well, wait, first of all, did you decide that was complete? And second, who are you to decide that that's complete? So isn't it interesting? It's like, there are a lot of them out there, and I love what Paul has just said about, this is just to get people thinking, to get people talking. It's a starting point. Okay, anyone else have anything they'd like to unmute and chime in around the whole subject of wheels of life? And again, remember that the wheel of life is very often used as an intake method, some way to allow a prospective client to have some sort of an experience that allows you to have a bit more. Oh yeah, Kathy. Yeah, you didn't see you appear there. Kathy, yes, you go right ahead.
I didn't mean to chime in now. I was going to chime in before. My perspective on this is I really have an aversion to those wheels for all the reasons you're talking about. You can argue, is what does it include, what doesn't? So when I work with somebody, I tend to use the mental, physical, emotional, spiritual sort of matrix, because that encompasses everything from joy to, to whatever, to relationships, to it allows me to help them explore without laying out categories that then somebody can say, well, you didn't think about this, or you didn't think of, but that's my bias.
Yep. Yeah, when you think about people in our profession, there are people operating practices as coaches that are highly educated, highly trained, highly insightful. And there are other people who thought it'd be an easy way to make some money. And so they've done the minimum and they're out there now presenting themselves. And so I do believe you end up with some people who have taken even the simple subject of asking someone what their life goals are. And some have turned it into a science, and others are using it as kind of like a little parlor game or just a question to be asking somebody. All of those are valid. It just presents to me again as someone who's all about the merging of brilliance, trying to find the brilliance that are out there. It gave me a lot to work with and a lot to dig through. Well, as I
We're
was,
trying to
yes, go
find
right
our
ahead.
divergent person.
Go right ahead, Paula, say that again.
We're trying to find our divergent person.
We're trying to find our divergent person. That's what it's really all about. And I think that's a really good insight, because to me, if we were to say that that the only goals that are important for you are the goals that align with your personality type, or that are part of the definition of your faction. And by the way, that's one of the whole points of divergent. If you go beyond the fact that it's an interesting story and say, what is the underlying message for for real society that this book brings forward, or the series of books brings forward. It's that we all have to be very aware of the fact that we put ourselves into factions, and other people will put us into factions, so, or into a little box, but none of us are represented by that box. And the restrictions that that box imposes, particularly when those restrictions are reinforced by those outside of us, we end up with some real challenges, some real problems. I'll give you an example of this. I watch a lot of different stuff on YouTube, and one of the categories of things on YouTube I find particularly fascinating are when people of other cultures come to the United States and talk about what their culture shocks were, or what they thought were the biggest differences. And there were these individuals who have now freed themselves from North Korea, however they ended up doing that. They all have their own fascinating story. But they end up in the United States, and one of the things that they say that really strikes them is this thought that to them is so foreign, that at some point in your life, you can change your career path if you want to, and you can do it as often as you want. For them, that is such a foreign concept that they struggle to even wrap their head around the thought that you would want to do that, let alone that you would be allowed to do that. And so I thought, isn't it interesting that when a population or when externals try to put boundaries around you, and you begin to accept those boundaries, you then start to impose those boundaries on your own life experience. And now who is the prison guard and who is the prisoner? Now you're one and the same. And so I thought, isn't that interesting? So yeah.
That's
Okay,
why I
anywho.
always see those kinds of things as Paula and Kathy were just talking about, as a starting point, more so than the end game, so to speak. We have a saying in South Africa that you never look at the new dawn through yesterday's eyes.
Ooh.
So when I talk with people, I'm always interested in the story behind what it is that they're actually perceiving. Because, you know, by and large, if you think about it from a neuroscience perspective, our behaviors are more about repetition than it is about the novelty of experiencing the new. And we're actually designed for that. So we're just incredibly designed to give status quo the upper hand, because that's what the brain likes to do. First in order of business is about preserving and conserving energy. So a new story will always be met with challenge. So I think those kind of wheels of life are good in terms of understanding your starting point, but you know, the hero's journey continues.
Exactly right. Yep. Okay, well, what I thought by the time I was done with all this was, I said, well, you know, what actually is giving rise to these lists of categories even being created? And my head immediately goes into, well, they're trying to create it based on their understanding of a change grid that they've never seen or never even looked at. You know, I mean, everyone has a change grid, obviously, but they don't know they have one. And they look at life through their location on the change grid, even though they didn't know they're on a location on the change grid. And so that means that while every individual may have some brilliant insights, again, we call it the merging of brilliance, the reason why the merging process is performed is so that we can expose the blind spots and compensate for the blind spots. So for everyone who came up with a list, we could find what was missing. And sometimes a lot of things were missing, and sometimes there was just one or two glaring absences. And so I thought, well, if it really is all based on someone's vantage point from wherever they're standing on the change grid, how do goals map to the change grid? And when kind of going like, oh, this could be interesting. So I set out to do precisely that. And so I ended up with this particular diagram. Can you guys see this pretty well? Somebody unmute and say yes, otherwise I'll assume you can all see.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, I will tell you right now that I did not put a whole lot of thought into perfecting the locations of things. I wanted to just kind of put something together nice and fast that I could then share with all of you guys and see if we could figure out what's really going on. And so I was creating this thing for the Oracle profile about looking at your life. And I ended up with these 25 different sorts of areas. And so what I would like to do is take what you're seeing here, this Oracle profile, and translate each one of these items into a plottable, well-stated activity. And so I thought, well, ultimately I need an activity list, but let's go ahead and go, well, where do these general categories of things fall onto the change grid? And that's what we're actually looking at. So yes, if you guys want to have a copy of this, I was going to send it to you as is, and I thought like, no, because to me, this is a work in progress. I don't want you to have something that you think is etched in stone when really it's just something that I threw together. So here goes. The diagram that you're looking at, you should kind of recognize is an attempt at an overlay on the change grid. It's not a literal overlay for reasons we'll get into a bit more deeply, but it's just talking about more the energy map of the change grid as opposed to levels of productive tension or assessments of challenge and difficulty. I wanted it more to just be a look at the energy map of what was going on. Now, one of the things that I wanted to add to this whole understanding of a wheel of life is a wheel of life is certainly about, gaining and growing and adding and expanding and all those sorts of things. But there is also, I think, needs to be an appreciation for danger zones. And the danger zone, the goal then is to stay out of that danger zone. And so the danger zone categories are what you'll see in red at the four corners. So I said, as far as area number 1 is concerned, up here in red, you see staying out of harm's way. Can you guys see that well enough, or do you want me to zoom in a bit? I'll assume.
No, that's good.
Okay, all right. All right, I can zoom in if you'd like. Yep.
T, this is Jane. So when you're saying number 1, staying out of harm's way, are you talking about these are the goals that you would have in that area?
The general category of, if I was in that area, what would
Right.
my goal be?
Okay.
So
Okay.
if I am in a situation where I view my abilities being very low and the challenges being very high, if I'm in that energy of the upgrid danger zone, what would all of you share as a goal?
Staying out of harm's way.
Get out of it, get out of harm's way. And so I don't know if there's room for a lot of goals up there. I think the goal is, in that particular place on the change grid, get out of here, get out of here. You are in a truly threatened place. And so if I turn that into a plottable activity, I might say something about, maybe staying out of harm's way is a fine way to put it, or keeping your, living a life free of jeopardy or out of harm. We need to find a way to phrase that activity in a way that's easily understood and can be assessed and plotted. Now, staying out of harm's way, if I said, I want you to stay out of harm's way, I would, again, this is a gifted student's kind of a little element I'm throwing in, but that may be the situation where that goal comes forward, but that is not the ideal that is not the ideal location to handle that situation appropriately. So current situation is what it is. It gives rise to a goal. In order to meet that goal, I may need to have a very different energy. So we'll explore that as we go on. But ultimately, I'm going to say, yeah, Paula, feel free to unmute and just chime in. Say anything.
Well, I was going to say, wouldn't the opportunity here might be, I meet life on life's terms, knowing I have the resources, something like that. to me would be how I stay out of the danger zone. In other words, it's no longer life, it's no longer a danger. I know I have the ability to manage through it.
Right.
That sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and we can do that. That's going to resonate with a couple of the other little areas around here. I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of an example of a starting point for what we would want to say. So for example, if you're in the outgrid danger zone, the outgrid danger zone tends to be a place of great conflict. So it's conflict with others. It's also conflict raging inside the individual, but there is a lot of that outgrid energy. Well, if I wanted to, I could say a goal in my life is to not be in that state. I don't want to live in I want to say an energetic state where conflict is essential. I look at people who decide to become attorneys, and I just went like, you actually invite other people to bring their conflict into your reality so that you can stand in front of a courtroom. And I can't imagine a job I'd enjoy less. So, but that's me. That may not be for everybody, but certainly I would go that if it's a goal, people can eliminate conflict. Now, just one more thing to throw in as we work our way around this. Remember that when someone fills out a ChangeWorks assessment, I am asking them to respond to 4 dimensions. And one of those dimensions is, how important is this to you? They may very well say that eliminating conflict is not important to them. And that's perfectly fine. But that gives us an opportunity to look a little bit more into why that is, what that means for them, how that leads to itself. So yeah, so I think that there's other levels of insight that adding this to the change grid conceptually can give rise to that. Okay, so again, you work your way around. If I'm in the downgrade danger zone, this is where the level of mastery someone thinks they have leads to a real kind of illusion of everything being absolutely under control. That leads to someone becoming more depressed, less active, less involved, becomes bored. Well, maybe there's a goal that says that I'd like to avoid the mental health issues of depression, or I'd like to eliminate boredom. I don't want a life that has whatever it is. Now, yes, I could phrase it to the positive, but that puts it elsewhere. That puts it out inside of the change grid, away from a danger zone. So that's why I think it's important that for each danger zone, we actually state something in terms of getting out of that danger zone or not being in that danger zone, just to see how that might add another dimension to it. On the in-grid danger zone, the real challenge is disappearing, getting lost, and having, the low self-esteem is also something that comes into play. So I want to discuss those danger zones in greater detail with you guys, but I want to just kind of acquaint you with what it is I put together as I worked my way around this. So the next thing that I did was I said, all right, well, let's look at the quadrants. And so what kinds of these goal lists, these categories of goals that others have come up with plot. And although I didn't say it yet, all I did was I took the things that came up again and again and again on everyone else's goal list and say, well, where does that resonate energetically on the change grid? And so if I look at the outgrid quadrant are all about those driven things, wanting to make something happen. Well, I thought, well, certainly career advancement would fall in that category, and anything having to do with leading the way, inspiring people, that would have part of it. Achieving some sort of financial well-being, that's an outgrid kind of thing. And then on the border would be some education and personal development things. And on the upgrade side of things, some social capital or fame might come into play. So being recognized and honored and worshiped. So I thought, well, those things can all seem to resonate. So first I moved all of these just into that quadrant. And then I went like, okay, well, energetically, which of those tend to be a little bit more upgrid? Which ones tend to be a little bit more downgrid? So I actually went to the 16 energies on the change grid and said, well, certainly financial well-being and some of that educational sort of stuff has an analytical element to it. And some part of career advancement can certainly have that driven driver in energy to it. Leading someone properly and having that, developing character and all those things that go along with that, that certainly has a little bit of an expressive sort of driver quality to it. And then the amiable driver we'll talk about more in just a second, but certainly as we are on a career path, we may work our way up through a whole chain of ever increasing roles that takes us through the amiable driver into the balanced driver into the driven driver. But if we're not careful, we could end up in that danger zone. So I'll shut up for a second, just say to all of you guys, can you kind of feel that there is a driver energy in each of these goal categories? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. All y'all unmute. It's emerging of brilliance. It's not the T and Brian show. So.
Well, I like it in particularly because you know how you talk about oftentimes when you make the list is something, or it could be something that's not on the list that's really driving the attention. And so by mapping these, what I always look for, like you like the typing of it, I like to look for what's behind it, what's behind the behavior itself. And sometimes that isn't necessarily expressed because they can't really see that part of it. They're just going through the experience, I think. So I like the mapping of this because you can see when you understand where it is on the grid itself, you can ask more questions to unfold some more of the story.
Thank you, Jane. Did you have something you want to chime in?
Oh, no, I was just saying you could, or I might make an argument for swapping leadership and character with career advancements. But, that's the thing is I think either one, it's really depends on the point of view and how you would.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the things that I was tossing around as I decided to do this initial layout. And I thought, okay, well, let's look at the energy behind what good leadership actually is. And as I thought about that, I thought about the best leaders I've ever known. They were a leader because they were motivating. They were a leader because they were inspiring. They were a leader because they could get other people to come behind them, to join in as followers. And so there was this charismatic personality sort of element to leadership, where when I thought about someone who just stays exactly on the heart line, and they are given a certain challenge and they meet it with their ability, challengeability. To me, this is the person who is like barreling forward. And if other people help them, fine, but they're so task focused that they really may sometimes even damage relationships or leave relationships in their wake. And so that's why I shifted leadership up a little bit, was just because I thought that expressive element needed to be part of the leader, where that driven driver, particularly the driven driver, I can see how they could be all about excelling at their career and to hell with anybody and everybody who's involved, or, they can bully their way into career advancement as well. So that was my thought. Yep.
I have a question. I like what you just said about putting leadership up a notch there. The thought crossed my mind about career achievement versus career advancements. I'm sure you thought about that. Did you? What was your rationale for not using the term achievement there?
Because as I, the merging of brilliance says we start by compiling everything we can find. I never saw anyone come up with a career achievement. It was always advancement. And I never even saw career development. I found
So you're just
career.
borrowing from other words.
Yeah, that's all I've done is I've shifted what my first compilation looked like onto the grid, and then our goal is to refine this and translate this into plottable activities. So I'm certainly not in any way against the idea about achievement, but how do you differentiate achievement and advancement?
Well,
To me, those are
thought about, if I can just quickly give you my thought about that. The reason that advancement implies that there is a structure within which people move their career, and there are entrepreneurs and others who achieve and take that driver energy and move it, but it doesn't necessarily predict a kind of advancement that is a sort of a ladder-like concept. So that's where I would say the implication of advancement to me is more corporate, or it's more you're advancing. You can advance with money, you can advance in a whole bunch of different ways, but that's my thinking. I just wanted to throw that out to the group. I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, well, I appreciate it because one of the other words that came up a lot was success. And I discarded it because I thought it was too general. Success is defined by individuals, and I'm going to say more often than not, success is defined in ways other than career. So they have successful families, they have successful, whatever, but it's not just so that's why I took success kind of away. Other thoughts about advancement versus achievement?
Well, I agree. I think they're two different things because you can advance in your career without ever achieving a whole lot. If there's a regimented career ladder in whatever work that you do, and you can achieve many things and not necessarily advance. So, you know.
Yeah, and I think one thing I like about what you guys are saying is that it's opening the door for something that could still be happening in the outgrid energy that has got nothing to do with career. So how come I can't just get rid of the word career and say that being outgrid is about advancement, achievement, accomplishment, whatever form that ends up taking?
That makes more sense to me.
It does, yeah. but if you the reason why I left the word career is because I was thinking, well, if this is supposed to be a general initial screening sort of a tool, do we need to make sure there's some place where there's a word that says this is where your job goes, or this question is about job?
I think that limits the possibilities of what a job is, be based on the structure of which somebody lives in or the culture they live in. Okay. I agree with the others. I think it needs to be more open.
All right, and so there's no reason why in the description of the activity, I couldn't say that this might be about career, this might be about, whatever else, but it still has to do with advancement, achievement, accomplishment, whatever. Do you guys have a favored word of those three? Advancement, achievement, accomplishment?
I like achievement.
I like achievement.
That's one of my core values. So, I would of course be drawn to that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one of my strengths on the strengths finder. But I'm thinking from in my research in sports science, they don't focus on what we call traditional goal setting. They focus on outcome development, which is all about the science of achievement, because you're more likely to get an outcome before you actually reach a set goal in a set time frame that you achieve. And so if you take and stack those different outcomes, that leads to the goal itself. And so that's what they tend to focus on.
Well, here's something that's going to be very interesting then, because achievement also appears downgrid. Achieving mastery is a very downgrade energy kind of thing. Because think in order to end up there, you have to view your ability as being extremely high and there's no challenge left. So I think it's all about mastery, but the achieving happened outgrid. This is just where you end up.
Yeah, I would focus on the mastery piece downgrid, and the achievement piece and the outgrid is where I would go.
Yeah, I agree with that.
All right. Okay. Um, okay. So again, and then when I looked at things like financial well-being, I thought, well, that's an analytical kind of an element too. You can't say you're well off financially unless you've actually looked at your situation and projections for the future. So there's an analytical element that's at least implied there, if not absolutely necessary. And then downgrid, a little bit further downgrid on the border between the driver quadrant and the analytical quadrant. That's where I thought kind of like education and personal development would kind of plop, because certainly education has a large analytical element to it, but a lot of education is done with an intention in mind. And if I put the engagement rings on here, this would be on the border between intention and engagement. So did you get the education for a reason? Or did you get the education for the joy of it? Well, analytical people tend to get education for the joy of it, and driven people tend to get education because it's a means to an end. So, so that's why I thought, like, well, feels like it's on the border. Let's slap it on the border. So, thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, now I'm going to go to the in-grid side of things for just a second, because if we just went back to the 4 quadrants. We talk about, here you got the driver, the opposite of the driver is the amiable. So I thought, okay, well, what would that amiable energy kind of contain in terms of these goals that have been kind of spelled out? And obviously the amiable energy is about people. Even if I use the people map profile, people is over on this side of things. So I went like, well, right there, everything having to do with primary relationships and friendships and family and parenting, these sorts of things definitely would fall in grid more on the energetic side of things. And so, and the reason why I kind of put them in the where they were, one slightly up grid, one on the heart line, one a little bit down grid, was because when I think about the energy that I would hold around my friends, hopefully my friends are my friends because I find them rather comfortable and easy to be around. And when it comes to my primary relationship, I thought, well, let's put that one on the hard line, because my primary relationship is supposed to be my complement. It's what balances me. It's what, you know, it completes me. And so I thought, well, that feels right there, where both family and parenting is always an exercise in adjusting and learning and, you know, coping with, dealing with, you know, because things are constantly changing. So whether you're dealing with your siblings as adults or whether you're a parent working with your kids, let's not underestimate that there is always a challenge that is moving you to look at and grow in terms of ability. So that's why I put those 3 in those relative positions. Any thoughts, comments about my relative positioning for those 3?
I think this will be interesting to see how some of the younger generation would map on this, because some tend to live a illusory, have a illusory perspective of friends and family because it's through technology. You know, so like they can have a gazillion friends on Facebook, but you have difficulty interacting with people, you know, in
I'm
person.
glad you brought that up. In fact, I'm going to put here social media as something to look at as well, because, oops, oh, I hate it when I mess things up. Because I thought, well, that might be another reason why it's slightly downgrade, because now that would become an analytical amiable. And certainly for someone to navigate social media, I mean, even just to go and do the basics, there's an analytical element involved. And to do social media well is a profoundly analytical endeavor. And so I think that's really very interesting to put it there. Yeah. Huh. Okay, now I want you to just notice for a second that the danger zone is there as well. And the reason why I put this here more about getting lost than about low self-esteem is that how often do we encounter people who put so much energy into caring for their friends and caring for their primary relationship and caring for their kids that they lose the essential self in all
Mhm.
that, or you even hear them start to define themselves in terms of that other relationship. So, um, I mean, I remember this struck me in a really big way at an event years and years and years ago when the circumstances don't matter, but there was a social thing having to do with business. And so I'm with my client, happens to be a male, and there's this gal next to him. And I said to her, well, tell me a little bit about yourself. And the first thing she said was, I'm his wife. And I thought, wow, that the very first thing you share with someone, the thing that's top of mind for you is that you are his wife. Well, aren't you you first? And so that's where I thought, like, people get lost in relationships. And so maybe that's why after someone becomes an empty nester, there's a depression that comes along because when that person or those people are gone, how now what's left of you? And
Mhm.
so that's what I think is this idea about getting lost.
I would love to recommend for that danger zone to take out low self-esteem and just say avoiding getting lost.
Well, and that'll be the activity for sure.
Yeah, because well, it's parallel to your other, to your other danger zones.
Right, right, right. Yeah, because we don't want people to cultivate low self-esteem. Some people
Yeah,
have perfected it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But it's
Yeah.
avoiding.
All right. So then I know we're coming up to the top of the hour here. I didn't realize this would stimulate as much dialogue as it has. No one's dropped off the call, so hopefully you found this interesting. But then I thought, well, I always have to deal with these in-betweeners. So what's halfway between amiable and analytical? On some of the 8-type personality systems, this type would be defined as the administrator. So the administrator is someone who keeps track of those things that are necessary for everybody else and everything else to happen. And so I thought, well, that's about creating a nice household, a good environment. This is about quality of life issues. And I didn't know where else to put material possessions because to me, material possessions, just that phrase triggers a negative response in me. Because if you're just accumulating things because you think accumulating things gives you social capital, then that would be up here. Where if you are accumulating things because you need them for your family to be taken care of and for, your life to be led, well, that to me is a very different sort of definition of material possessions. So, yeah, thoughts about that?
Would that be the same thing as like a person who hoard things?
Well, let's think about that. Why do people hoard things? When we're talking about hoarding as being what do I want to say a psychological issue. Why do they do that? What does hoarding things give them?
Gives some security.
Security.
Security, a sense of control. It's all an illusion, but for whatever reason, they collect things and collect things, and for some reason, it gives them some sense of comfort.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think we all suffer from that to a certain degree. How many of you, this may be the guys in particular because of the way we've been socialized, but how many of you find it very difficult to throw away an extra screw? You put something together, you have an extra screw. It's kind of like, you can't throw away a screw. I mean, so you end up with some plastic, jar filled with screws, lone
Guilty.
screws. Yeah,
Guilty.
you never know when you're going to need that screw. Yeah. Okay, anyway, our time's up for today. So on Thursday, we'll continue this and look at the downgrid and the upgrid sorts of goal groupings. And certainly the center is most fascinating, and that's where we get to this little blue spot in the little lower corner there. If you guys would find it interesting, I'm more than happy to take a screenshot of this and send it to everybody in the next reminder for this call. Would you guys want that? Is that something you might like to do?
Yes.
Sure.
Obviously, it's a work in progress. That's the whole point of bringing this to the circle of brilliance before we kind of etch it in any final form. Just don't lose track of the goal here. Our overall goal is to develop an activity list, one key activity for each of the 25 areas that are shown, so we can use this as, to me, a more complete screening sort of a tool. So yeah, the 6 type and the 8 type, those are all fine for screening. I'd like to give someone a more complete first exposure to the Oracle of the Self. Again, the Oracle of the Self is all about exploring the conversations that you are having with you about you. And so to whatever degree we can be as inclusive as possible without going to an absurd extreme, that's it. And 24 activities, now we're kind of like right at the, I wouldn't want to push it much further than that for someone's first experience. But to me, having 24, 25 activities, I think gives our initial survey a little bit more substance to it, that it may be perceived as being a bit more valuable because it isn't one of these quick 6, 8, 10 sort of parlor gamey kinds of things that BuzzFeed will put out and tell you what state you live in. So you get the idea. You know, I want it to have some substance to it and I want it to be useful. And I thought, what better way to do that than to see, does this plot on the change grid, is there an overlay? And at least so far, are you guys feeling that there's a potential for a legitimate overlay
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
on this?
Yeah, I just want to say, maybe we can talk about this more next time. Creative pursuit seems like it should be more of an expressive, energy, amiable, expressive, amiable, or
Yeah.
expressive.
Yeah, bring that up, because what we're going to be talking about is, where does true art live? When we're talking about a really skilled artist or someone who is a crafter, but a crafter who has taken their talent up a little bit, where does that live on the change grid? And I'll go ahead and throw out, you're going to develop a great appreciation for the expressive analytical. The expressive analytical. So in our community here, quilting is big business, people, let me tell you. And so I'm going like, well, it's a quilt like grandma used to make. And I'm going like, oh, how nice could they possibly, but so, oh, you got to go to the quilt show. You got to go to the quilt show. These people are doing masterpieces in quilt. And so I just kind of went like, I had no idea that that level of quilting even existed, let alone that people had the talent to actually do it. So when I think about creative pursuits, I'll be asking you guys, what energy are you at? What level of tension are you at where your natural creativity begins to flow? What state, where is that on the change grid? And we're going to be making a distinction between that mindset and the mindset of creative problem solving. Where does creative problem solving fit? Or where does creative marketing or creativity with a targeted purpose versus creativity for the sake of artistic expression? Where does it all come to play? To me, it's a wonderful discussion to explore, but there are cases to be made for multiple locations on the change grid. And it's only when we start getting more fine-tuned that those many different ways that creativity expresses itself find their individual home.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So with that, thank you all very, very much for joining in on today's call. We will continue where we left off on Thursday. Do watch for a reminder from Linda, and it will have the screenshot of what we've talked about today. Okay, so thanks everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye for now. Bye.